I wasn't looking for a conspiracy theory when I started this investigation. I was looking for a country, Tartaria. It's on the maps, real ones. Amsterdam, 1706, Paris, 1720, London, 1783. Not a footnote or a border dispute, but a massive labeled territory stretching across northern Asia with the same casual confidence as France or Spain sitting right next to it. And then, if you believe a very specific corner of the internet, it disappears. Not renamed, not conquered. Erased, according to the theory, along with its giants, its impossible architecture, and a global cataclysm nobody's supposedly allowed to talk about. Millions of people believe some version of this. Videos with titles like "The Lost Empire They Erased from History" rack up tens of millions of views. Reddit threads run thousands of comments deep, while Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members trade photographs of old buildings back and forth like evidence in a trial. And somewhere in the last 5 or 6 years, Tartaria stopped being an obscure historical map label that only cartography nerds cared about, and became shorthand for an entire worldview. That everything we've been taught about the 1800s is a cover story, that the buildings around us are inherited rather than built, and that somewhere out there is a version of history so dangerous it had to be scrubbed from every archive on Earth simultaneously. So here's what this video actually is. Not a debunking exercise where I mock people for believing something, and not a defense of the theory either. It's an investigation into how a real cartographic term turned into the load-bearing myth for one of the strangest, most persistent conspiracy ecosystems on the internet, and into why. Once you understand the actual mechanism behind it, it becomes very hard to watch these videos the same way again. Let's start with the thing that's actually verifiably true, because that's always where these investigations have to begin. Tartary was a real name. For centuries, European cartographers used it as a catch-all label for the vast, poorly surveyed regions of Central and North Asia, roughly the area that was later absorbed administratively into the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty in China, and a shifting patchwork of Central Asian khanates and tribal confederations. You'll find the name on maps by Guillaume Delisle, on English atlases sold in London bookshops, and on Russian imperial survey documents held in archives you can still request today. Here's the important part, the part the theory quietly skips past every single time. Europeans didn't fully understand this region when they were labeling it. They didn't have reliable ground surveys of it. Explorers hadn't walked most of it. Cartographers back in Paris and Amsterdam were working from secondhand reports, merchant accounts, and earlier maps copied from earlier maps, which is exactly how cartography worked for most of human history before satellite imaging existed. So they did what mapmakers have always done with territory they didn't fully understand. They used a broad, deliberately vague regional name. The same way old European maps once labeled unexplored continental interiors terra incognita, or the way an entire ethnically staggering diverse continent got flattened by outsiders into the phrase the dark continent. Tartary wasn't a nation-state with a unified government, a single currency, a standing army, or a capital city. It was what linguists call an exonym, an outside name imposed by people who weren't from there, describing land they hadn't actually surveyed. Nobody living in Kazakh, Mongol, or Manchu territory in the 1600s woke up and called their homeland Tartary. It wasn't their name for themselves. It was a label stamped on from thousands of miles away by people drawing maps from secondhand travelers' tales. And as Russian and Chinese state surveying improved through the 1700s and 1800s, as actual administrators mapped actual borders on the ground, the vague label got replaced the way any vague placeholder label eventually gets replaced by something more specific and accurate. This is not a mysterious process. It's the same reason the Orient stopped being used by serious scholars as a catch-all term for a staggering range of distinct Asian cultures. It's the same reason Indian, as a blanket European term for hundreds of distinct sovereign nations across 2 continents, slowly gave way, at least in careful writing, to actual tribal and national names as ethnography, treaties, and government contact improved. That's it. That's the entire disappearance the theory treats as sinister. Not an erased empire, not a deleted civilization, not a cataclysm swallowed by silence. Ordinary cartographic housekeeping, the same kind that happens to every vague regional label in history once the people drawing the maps actually go and look. So the real question worth asking isn't, where did Tartaria go? It's why this completely ordinary process of maps becoming more accurate over time gets reframed 2.5 centuries later as the deliberate deletion of an entire civilization. And the answer to that question has almost nothing to do with the 1700s, and almost everything to do with how internet content works today, which we'll come back to. Now let's talk about the architecture, because this is where the theory gets its most visually compelling hook. And it's worth taking seriously as a piece of persuasive filmmaking, even though the underlying conclusion doesn't hold up under real scrutiny. The claim, repeated across dozens of these videos with only minor variation, goes like this. 19th century World's Fair buildings, structures like Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition, San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts, and ornate train stations and government buildings scattered across multiple continents, are supposedly too elaborate, too stylistically uniform across unconnected countries, and were supposedly built far too quickly to have been constructed with the labor and technology historians say was available at the time. Therefore, the argument goes, these buildings weren't built in the 1800s at all. They were inherited from some earlier, more technologically advanced civilization, and 19th century governments simply took credit, slapped a dedication plaque on the front, and rewrote the historical record to hide the theft. It's a dramatic claim, and it photographs beautifully, which is exactly why it works so well on video. But here's what actually explains the stylistic uniformity, and it happens to be a genuinely fascinating, well-documented piece of real architectural history that gets almost no attention because it isn't mysterious enough to go viral. It's called the Beaux-Arts movement. Architects trained at one specific, extremely influential school, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, fanned out across the world over the course of the 19th century and consciously, deliberately designed buildings using a shared classical vocabulary they'd all been taught in the same classrooms. Symmetrical facades, monumental columns, grand central domes, all self-consciously borrowing from Greek and Roman precedent, because that borrowing was the entire point of the movement. That is not a coincidence, requiring a lost civilization to explain it. That is precisely what happens when hundreds of architects pass through the same training pipeline and are all consciously, openly reviving the same classical influences on purpose, as a matter of professional pride. It's the same reason so many American bank buildings from the 1910s and 1920s look like Roman temples with columns out front. Nobody needed a hidden civilization to explain that pattern either. It was a trend. A well-documented, extensively written about architectural trend, taught in schools, discussed in professional journals of the era, with a mountain of surviving correspondence, blueprints, and construction photographs proving exactly that. As for the construction speed argument, which is maybe the most repeated single claim in this entire genre, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair buildings genuinely were built at an astonishing pace, and the real explanation for that is almost more impressive than the myth, not less. They weren't built from solid quarried stone the way the videos always imply. They were built from a material called staff, essentially plaster mixed with jute fiber and applied over wood and steel framing, a material explicitly chosen because it could be molded into elaborate ornamental shapes quickly and cheaply. It was designed to look monumental temporarily and then be demolished once the fair ended, which is exactly what happened to almost all of those buildings within a year or two of the fair closing. The speed of construction isn't evidence of some hidden, more advanced civilization's leftover infrastructure. It's evidence that the entire fairground was a spectacular, deliberate stage set, something the fair's own organizers were completely open about in newspapers, planning documents, and promotional materials, because the whole point of a World's Fair was theatrical spectacle, not permanent architecture. The oversized doors and grand staircases claim follows the same pattern. Something already thoroughly explained gets stripped of its context and reframed as an unsolved mystery. Grand 19th century public buildings, courthouses, capitol buildings, and train terminals were deliberately built tall and monumental for reasons architects wrote about extensively and proudly at the time. They were designed to project institutional permanence, civic power, and a sense of awe in visitors, the same psychological impulse behind a cathedral's soaring ceiling or a courthouse's echoing rotunda. Nobody standing in a Gilded Age train station in 1885 was confused about why the ceiling was 60 feet high. It's only when you strip away that historical context a century and a half later and photograph the same building in isolation with dramatic music underneath that why is this door 12 feet tall? It gets asked as though it's a genuinely novel question nobody has ever considered before. In reality, it's something architectural historians settled a very long time ago. Now the Giants, which is probably the single most emotionally effective piece of the entire mythology, and it's worth walking through carefully because the mechanism behind it is more interesting than the claim itself. The core evidence cited across almost every one of these videos is nearly identical. 19th century newspaper reports describing giant human skeletons unearthed during railroad construction or farming, and old photographs showing unusually tall individuals standing next to average height people in formal Victorian portraits. On the newspaper reports specifically, yes, these absolutely exist. You can find them in digitized newspaper archives today. And no, that does not mean they were secretly true. American newspapers throughout the 1800s operated with essentially none of the editorial fact-checking standards we now associate with responsible journalism. Sensational, completely uncorroborated stories were a real, well-documented, and extremely common genre of writing at the time. Sea serpents supposedly spotted off the coast, cases of spontaneous human combustion, discoveries of giant skeletons. Some were printed purely to sell more papers on a slow news day, and some were outright fiction that the editors themselves knew perfectly well was fiction. Historians of American journalism have written extensively about this era of what's sometimes called tall tale journalism, and it's a genuinely fascinating rabbit hole on its own. Not one of the widely circulated giant skeleton discoveries repeated across these videos has ever produced a surviving physical specimen, a peer-reviewed excavation report, or a verifiable museum accession record that actually holds up once you trace it back to its source. The Smithsonian did not quietly lose hundreds of giant skeletons sent to it for study, as the theory claims. There simply isn't a credible documentary trail showing that the Smithsonian ever received the vast majority of these supposed specimens in the first place. That is a very different and much more mundane explanation than a cover-up. The photographs, in a strange way, turn out to be the easiest part of the whole theory to explain, because we know in great detail how period photography handled exactly this kind of image. Forced perspective techniques, deliberate composite exposures, and trick backdrops were well-understood tools among Victorian photographers, used specifically to create dramatic or exaggerated effects for paying customers who wanted memorable portraits. And separately, several of the specific images circulating in these videos are simply photographs of real circus and sideshow performers. They were billed completely openly at the time, using the word giant right there on the promotional poster. These were real people with real medically documented conditions, touring under stage names whose biographies survive in period newspapers, circus route records, and in some cases, medical studies written by doctors who examined them while they were alive. The theory works by stripping these documented named performers of their biographies and historical context, then representing the same photographs as unexplained anomalies. It makes it appear as though nobody at the time knew who these people were or why they were tall, when their contemporaries absolutely did know because it was advertised. Here's the detail that should give anyone pause about this claim more than almost any other in the mythology. Gigantism is a real, thoroughly understood medical condition. It is caused by a usually benign tumor on the pituitary gland producing excess growth hormone, and it genuinely can produce people in the 7 to 8 foot range, sometimes taller. That's not an ancient mystery requiring a lost race of giants to explain. That's modern endocrinology, studied and documented extensively throughout the 20th century. The tallest verified human being in recorded history, Robert Wadlow, lived well into the 20th century and stood 8 feet 11 inches tall. His entire life, including the precise medical cause of his height and the gland involved, is extensively documented in hospital records, photographs, and contemporary news coverage. There's no gap in our scientific understanding here that requires inventing a hidden civilization of 9-foot-tall overseers to fill. It's worth pausing here to talk about why this particular theory spread so effectively, because that's actually the more interesting mystery once you strip away the historical claims themselves. Notice the rhetorical pattern that appears in almost every Tartaria video, including, frankly, the ones that inspired this one. State a real, independently verifiable detail, something you could check yourself in an afternoon, and then immediately attach an unfalsifiable, dramatic question to it. Why do these buildings share the same architectural style? That is a completely real question, with a completely real, well-documented answer. The Beaux-Arts movement, something you could learn about in any architectural history textbook. But phrase it instead as, why do these buildings share this exact style, unless something is being deliberately hidden from us? And suddenly it becomes a question that sounds like it demands the same kind of dramatic, hidden answer, when in reality it is quietly smuggling in a conclusion the actual evidence never supported in the first place. This particular technique has a name in rhetoric. When it is done rapidly, it is sometimes called the Gish Gallop, burying one real answerable question underneath a dozen loosely connected questions so quickly that fact-checking any single one feels like missing the larger pattern everyone else supposedly already sees. Nearly every script in this genre does this, stacking rhetorical why questions at the end of every section, daring the viewer to notice that each individual question, taken on its own and researched for even 10 minutes, already has a fairly ordinary, well-documented answer sitting in a library or peer-reviewed journal somewhere. The other engine driving all of this is something researchers who study conspiracy theories professionally sometimes call the appeal of stigmatized knowledge. It is the powerful, genuinely pleasurable feeling that the real history is being deliberately hidden from you specifically, and that by watching this video, by really paying attention, you are joining a small, special group of people who can finally see what mainstream institutions supposedly don't want anyone to see. That feeling is not a small thing. It is genuinely enjoyable. In the same way solving a puzzle is enjoyable, and it is not a coincidence that videos in this genre lean so heavily on phrases like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. That phrase isn't describing a piece of evidence at all. It is describing the emotional experience of feeling personally let in on a secret that most people are supposedly too asleep to notice. And that emotional payoff is what actually gets shared, commented on, and rewatched, regardless of whether the underlying claims survive contact with a library. None of this makes the people who genuinely believe the theory foolish or gullible. It makes the format itself extremely effective at what it does. Real, unresolved historical questions absolutely exist. Archives really do get lost or destroyed in fires and wars. Historical records really are incomplete and huge, frustrating gaps, especially for marginalized peoples whose written records were suppressed or destroyed by colonizing powers. That is a real and serious historical grievance, completely separate from any of this. Institutions really have gotten embarrassing, significant things wrong before and been forced to correct the record decades later. The Tartaria mythology works precisely because it borrows the texture and emotional shape of that kind of legitimate historical revision. Then it applies that same shape to specific claims that, when you actually check them against primary sources, newspaper archives, architectural records, and medical literature, simply do not hold up. If you strip away the hidden ancient civilization framing entirely, there's a genuinely fascinating real story sitting underneath all of this, and it doesn't need a single ounce of embellishment to be worth 40 minutes of your attention. The real story is about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair functioning as a piece of deliberate architectural propaganda, an entire fake, ancient-looking city built out of plaster on purpose. It was designed specifically to make a young, insecure industrial nation look as though it belonged in the same historical lineage as Rome and Athens, at a moment when American elites were deeply anxious about being seen as culturally inferior to Europe. The real story is about how 18th century map labels reflect the actual limits of what distant colonial and imperial powers genuinely knew about a region, not some hidden truth about what existed there. The real story is about the wild, completely unregulated newspaper culture of the 1800s, and how easily an invented filler story from a slow news day could become treated, more than a century later, as a suppressed historical document. And the real story, maybe the most interesting one of all, is about why millions of people today, living in an era with more access to historical archives than any generation before them, are still drawn so powerfully to the idea that they personally are the ones who have finally seen through the lie everyone else is too distracted to notice. Every one of those threads is a legitimate, well-documented rabbit hole you could spend an entire weekend falling into. None of them require giants. None of them require a global cataclysm. And none of them require an erased, continent-spanning empire. It's worth spending a few minutes on how this same storytelling engine gets reused across completely different subjects. Because once you notice the pattern in one Tartaria video, you start noticing it everywhere in this same corner of the internet. And that repetition is itself a clue about how the genre actually works. The exact same narrative shape gets applied to Antarctic exploration, where real historical figures like the American naval officer Charles Wilkes or the British explorer James Clark Ross, men who genuinely led real, well-documented 19th century expeditions, get reframed as having stumbled onto something so dangerous their governments supposedly suppressed it for a century. The real history here is genuinely interesting on its own terms without any embellishment. These expeditions did face real disputes, real court-martials, and real editorial disagreements about what belonged in an official published account versus a private journal, because that's exactly how 19th century naval reporting worked. Official published accounts were always more polished and less personal than raw logs and private letters, the same way a company's public press release reads differently from the internal messages behind it. That gap between formal and informal writing is completely normal, is documented in the historiography of polar exploration, and doesn't require buried cities or coordinated global silence to explain. The same storytelling shape gets applied to atmospheric events like the New England dark day of May 19th, 1780, which genuinely happened and genuinely terrified people at the time. It also has a well-supported scientific explanation involving smoke from large wildfires, combined with an unusual weather pattern that trapped the smoke close to the ground. Modern atmospheric scientists have modeled and published on that explanation using tree ring and soot data from the period. None of it requires a civilization-ending cataclysm. It requires forest fires and stagnant air, which, while less cinematic, is what the actual physical evidence points to. And the same shape gets applied to explorers like Percy Fawcett in the Amazon, a real figure whose disappearance in 1925, while searching for a legendary lost city he called Z, remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of 20th century exploration. His story doesn't need any embellishment to be fascinating. The real archaeology of the Amazon basin, including terra preta soils, geoglyphs uncovered by deforestation in Acre, and raised agricultural fields, has genuinely revised what historians and archaeologists believe about pre-contact Amazonian civilization. And all of that happened through ordinary, published, peer-reviewed science, not through suppressed manuscripts or silenced expeditions. What ties every one of these videos together isn't a real historical connection between Antarctic ice, Amazonian soil, a New England dark sky, and a Central Asian map label. There isn't one. What ties them together is a shared production formula, because they're often written using the exact same structural template regardless of subject matter. The reluctant first-person investigator who wasn't looking for this, the real historical anchor fact stated accurately in the first few minutes to establish credibility. The official explanation presented fairly enough to seem balanced. The pivot sentence, almost always some version of the phrase, the official explanation collapses here. And then the accumulation of loosely related coincidences that are never individually claimed as proof, followed by a closing barrage of unanswered questions. Once you can see that template, you can predict almost line for line how any new video in this genre will be structured before it reaches its second act. It doesn't matter whether that week's subject is giants, Antarctica, or lost forests. That predictability is itself strong evidence that what you're watching is a content formula optimized for watch time and shareability, not an evolving historical investigation, building new evidence over time the way real scholarship does. There's also something worth saying honestly about the historians, archaeologists, and geologists whose legitimate work gets pulled into these videos as supporting evidence, because that may be the part of this phenomenon that deserves the most sympathy. Researchers who did genuinely important peer-reviewed work revising the timeline of pre-contact Amazonian settlement, or geologists who mapped real anomalous soil chemistry in Central Asia, did careful, often years-long scientific work. That work gets clipped out of its original academic context, stripped of its nuance and caveats, and dropped into videos implying these researchers were hinting at cover-ups. In reality, they were doing exactly what scientists are supposed to do, publishing findings that update the historical record through ordinary peer review, footnotes, follow-up studies, and academic conferences. That is the unglamorous, undramatic process real historical revision actually goes through. It is slower and far less cinematic than a suppressed archive, but it is also the only process that has ever produced a genuine, lasting correction to the historical record. That's worth remembering the next time a video implies that real science and institutional secrecy are somehow the same thing. So where does all of this actually leave us? Tartary was a real, genuinely used name for a real, genuinely undersurveyed region phased out over time in the same ordinary way vague geographic labels disappear once better information arrives. The buildings were built exactly when the historical record says they were built, by a well-documented, openly self-described architectural movement. Some were literally constructed from plaster with a built-in expiration date because that was the entire point of a World's Fair. The giants in the photographs were sideshow performers with documented names and medically understood conditions, or they were newspaper fiction printed to sell copies on a Tuesday in 1885. None of it required a cataclysm, an erasure, or a hidden guardian class of 9-foot-tall overseers running construction projects nobody else could manage. What did require something, though, and this part is completely real, was the internet's powerful appetite for exactly this kind of story. The pleasure of feeling like you found the thread nobody else pulled. The satisfaction of connecting dots that were never actually connected in the first place. That part isn't going away anytime soon, and maybe that's the actual mystery worth investigating here. Not what happened to a lost empire, because nothing happened to it. There wasn't one. But what it says about all of us that we keep needing there to have been a hidden civilization right beneath our feet this entire time, quietly waiting to finally be found.